Good evening, everybody. Oh, that was nice unison. I'm so happy you all took the time to join us. I'm Dean Phillips, and this library is a very special place to me. It was where, as a little boy, I learned how to read. When I was a little bit of an older boy, it's where I declared my candidacy essentially for a seat in Congress. About a year and a half ago, in this very room, my first public forum. So it's good to be back, everybody. And I want to first introduce our esteemed guests. I'll make then some opening remarks, and we're going to have a wonderful and I think very engaging discussion about a topic that you know is very near and dear to my heart, and that is reforming our campaign finance system in this country. So to that end, I'm so thrilled that we have Congressman John Sarbanes from the great state of Maryland here with us today, who is leading the charge in Congress and the Reformation Congress we're about to speak. And Tiffany Muller, the president of End Citizens United. And former representative, Minnesota Representative Ryan Winkler. And in the spirit of full disclosure, Congressman Sarbanes and Tiffany Muller and I just came directly here from the Minnesota State Fair. What did you most enjoy about that experience, if I might ask?
Sliding down that big slide.
How about that?
And the cookies, of course.
The fried cookie dough. That fried cookie dough was so good.
We figured we could not hold a public forum with our special esteemed out-of-town guests without a stop at the Minnesota State Fair, of course. So as you all know, we are here to talk about something that is terribly important to all of us up here, hopefully to all of you, and as I say to so many, no matter what your number one issue is, I hope your number two issue becomes campaign finance reform, because it is foundational to accomplish anything that is important to any of us, no matter if you're a Republican, a Democrat, an independent, anyone in between. We have a culture of corruption in Washington that is staggering. It is coming to light in ways that I'm sure none of us ever anticipated, but very important that we pay attention, and most importantly, send more people to Congress with the courage to take action. And that's why I'm so honored to have everybody with me on the stage today. I also want to honor John McCain, Senator McCain, who passed away this week. No matter if you agreed with his politics, he is an American hero, and he was one of the very last members of the United States Congress as a senator to pass campaign finance reform. McCain-Feingold in 2002 is something that I certainly honor him for. It had consequences that we might even talk about today, of course, but the fact that the last effort at reformation was 2002 is in no small part of what is so wrong with the lack of action in Congress right now. So with that said, I want to thank all of you for taking the time to come on a rainy night and engage in this important conversation. This is the first of a number of policy forums that our campaign is hosting, but they're public, open to anybody. I don't think anybody had to pay to come in here tonight. And I want to remind all of you that we're inviting Eric Paulson to all of these, because we believe it's important that both candidates appear side by side in public forums and allow voters to ask questions of us. And that's what all of you have the opportunity to do today. We're going to do some introductions. Each of our panelists will introduce themselves. I've got a few questions we'll tee this off with. And then ultimately, I want questions from all of you that I will engage in and moderate a discussion. So thanks for coming, and why don't we turn it over to Congressman Sarbanes for a little introduction.
Thank you very much, Dean. It's great to be here. I want to thank you all for coming out tonight. I want to thank you for your support of Dean Phillips. I'm excited to be here. I know you're excited about his candidacy. We're excited about it as well. Those of us who are serving in Congress right now want to kind of break through this logjam when it comes to making sure that people's voices are heard in government again. And leaning in on this issue of campaign finance reform, I think, as Dean indicated, is the baseline issue. Everything flows from that. If we can't get money's influence out of the mix, and we can't do the things we want to do on the economy or the environment or healthcare or anything else, because money is calling the shots as long as it's as important as it's become in Washington. But there are ways that we can combat this, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. I'm really thrilled to be in Minnesota. I've never been to the State Fair before, so I enjoyed that. But Hubert Humphrey was an icon in my family. I grew up in politics. My father was in politics. We were close to the Mondales as well. The first date I went on with my now wife, we've been married 30 years, she told me on that day that she cried when Walter Mondale lost his bid for the presidency and wrote him a letter. And I knew then that she was the perfect one for me. So anyway, it's great to be here, and great to be here with Dean and the others who are part of this panel tonight. I think it's going to be a great conversation. I got to Congress 12 years ago. I decided immediately I wanted to put on the night vision goggles that kind of let you see how money flows in Washington. Once you do that, you realize that it's everywhere. It infects everything. And there's a lot of really good people who go to serve in Congress and they get very quickly taken hostage by the money system. And they want to be free of it. You want them to be free of it. You want your voice to be heard again, but there's a deep, deep cynicism in the country. People don't really believe this can happen. They feel so left out. They don't see themselves represented. They don't see their priorities and interests represented. They just see a bunch of insiders that call the shots. The question is, can we do something about it? And the answer is we can. All across the country, people are taking the anger, the cynicism, the frustration they feel, and they're channeling it towards positive solutions. You see this at the state and local level. We can do in Congress what is being done in places, laboratories all across this country, to give the voice of everyday Americans back to those Americans so they feel invested again, so they have ownership, so they have power. And this really is about power. You get angry when you feel powerless, and you feel powerless in your own democracy when you feel like money is the one that calls the shots, and that your opinion, your input, your priorities are not given the consideration that they should. So we can change this power dynamic, and we're going to talk a little bit about that tonight. I'm privileged to serve as chair of something called the Democracy Reform Task Force. That's where we have worked really hard over the last couple of years to assemble a positive, affirmative package of reforms that if Democrats get the gavel back this fall, in the House of Representatives, we're going to make the first order of business. We're going to make that H.R. 1. We're going to show the American electorate that we can lead on this issue of reform and fighting corruption. And we're just asking people, give us that chance. We know you're skeptical. We know the cynicism is deep. But I believe we can fix our democracy. We can do it with your support, your help, and with you believing that this can happen. So it's great to be here tonight. I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Congressman. President of Citizens United.
Well, thank you so much for having me here tonight. Thank you so much for all of you for coming out tonight, especially in the storm that I know we all drove through to get here. That reminded me, I grew up in Kansas and Missouri, and that storm outside looks a lot like what I was used to growing up. First, I'm honored to be here with Dean Phillips. I was here, what was that, a few months ago, and had the privilege to go around to a number of different house parties. So some of you I actually met, and some of you I was at your house. And what I loved was seeing people from across ideologies and from across the district and from across parties who were coming together to support Dean because he represented hope, and he represented change, and he represents what I think we all are looking for, which is the opportunity to send folks to Washington who are ready to join forces with good members like Congressman Sarbanes and really take our country back and put it back in your hands and give your voice back to you. So I'm thrilled to be here again. I am thrilled that Dean is one of our top priority candidates this cycle, and I'm looking forward to having this conversation tonight. So I'm president of Citizens United, and you say, okay, so what's that? That's fair. We are a grassroots-powered organization of over 4 million members across the country. 4 million people, not corporations, not special interest groups, but individuals who want to reform our government and who want to get big money out of politics, who actually understand that all of us joining together at $15 a person can take on the Koch brothers, or can take on that type of big outside money that we have flowing into our system. We've always had money in politics, but right now what we see is a tilt in the balance of power. So much so that policy decisions are being made not for what benefits you, but for what benefits the special interest and their lobbyists in Washington. And there are a lot of really good members in Congress. I was a chief of staff on the Hill. I understand how this works. There are a lot of really good members of Congress who are ready to help make that change. But first, we have to take back the House. Because right now, there are about 20 common sense measures that could actually start to change the system of money and politics and campaign finance that we have. But we just don't have the votes. We could, Congressman Sarbanes has been working on this for years, and we are privileged to connect our grassroots members with those efforts and to make sure that there is power coming from the grassroots base to help get something passed. But we need disclosure and transparency. We need to empower small dollar donors. We need to close loopholes that are letting foreign money flow into our system. We need to stop the revolving door between lobbyists and Congress. These are all things that we can do. And the other thing that we're working on day in and day out is a long-term plan to overturn Citizens United, because we believe that corporations are not people. And we believe that they should not be able to just put unlimited and undisclosed money into our political system and try to buy seats in Congress. We believe that the power should belong in the hands of the people, not just those with the biggest checkbook. So every day, what I am so excited about is that we have a whole class of candidates running this cycle. None as great as Dean, but a lot who are really, really amazing and who have understood that we have to give our system back to you, and who are running on getting money out of politics first and foremost in their campaign. 100 of them are running, not taking a dime from corporate PACs. Not a dime. They're funding their campaign through individuals like you. Dean has over 50,000 individual contributions, and his average donation is just $28. That's amazing. That's the way it should be done. And what we know is that that's already changing the debate on the Hill and with members of Congress, because they see your passion and they see the passion of these candidates running, and they understand that the very first thing we need to do when we take back the House in November is to pass a clean up Congress bill. So we're excited to help work on all of those things, and I'm excited to be here with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dean, for inviting me here tonight, and more importantly, thank you for inviting everyone here tonight. Your model of a campaign that is bringing people into the political process, making their voices not just heard but front and center, is obvious. I've seen it at parades. In fact, it's hard to get to the parade. You got so many volunteers. We've seen it at house parties in my legislative district. We've seen it all through your campaign. You have been bringing people in and saying you have a voice because your voice and your position matters. Money is power. That's why money flows into the political system, because it wants more power. The other source of power in our system is votes. It's voices, it's the average person. We have numbers. And so the best and most powerful antidote to money in politics is people in politics. So thank all of you for your participation in being here tonight, because while I am a strong supporter of campaign finance reform, it's absolutely critical, we don't have to worry about it if everybody showed up and voted, if everybody participated in the campaign, and if everybody gave $28, because that would overpower the money in the system. I think the reason I was invited tonight is because when I served in the legislature in 2010, Citizens United came down. And it was very quickly obvious after that decision that we could not continue our century-long prohibition of corporate money in politics. And so we did the best thing that we could possibly do in reaction to that, and that was to require disclosure of where the money was coming from. So in the 2010 legislative session, when Tim Pawlenty was still the governor, Minnesota passed some of the toughest campaign finance disclosure laws in the country as a result of that decision. And there were compromises along the way, which leaves a lot of work left to be done. But the point is that in 2010, we could follow the money. And I don't know if any of you remember somebody named Tom Emmer, or maybe you've met somebody named Tom Emmer. But in 2010, Tom Emmer very badly wanted to be the Tea Party governor of Minnesota. And I had served with him in the Minnesota House. His positions on issues from choice to same-sex marriage and almost everything you can imagine were extremely right-wing. And in 2010, a bunch of very popular Minnesota corporations decided it would be a good idea to take the money that we spend at their stores and put it into the campaign. They funded something, a PAC essentially, and because we had disclosure laws on the books, we could follow the money. And I don't know if you remember, but Target Corporation was one of those companies. And because of disclosure, Target was so badly shamed in Minnesota for what they did, that they pulled money out of that PAC. That's the power of disclosure at a very basic level. The power to have everyone know who's spending money. And then with knowledge, the power of people to show up and vote or to boycott becomes that much greater. So that, to me, is a hopeful sign. People participating this year in record numbers from what I have seen, upturning the power dynamic that has benefited the wealthy and the powerful so greatly. And we have candidates like Dean Phillips, who does not need to be running. Dean and his family will be just fine, regardless of what Congress does. But you have a public service spirit that is going to drive this campaign, and by inviting everybody in, you are taking on somebody who is a top 10 PAC donation recipient in Congress, somebody who votes with Donald Trump 98% of the time, somebody who pretends to be a milquetoast moderate but is actually enabling the worst and darkest tendencies that are happening in our politics today. So, Dean, you're doing it. Your involvement will do the job, and finally, until we overturn Citizens United, disclosure will show who's on our side and who's on the side of people like Eric Paulson. So thank you, and I look forward to a great discussion.
Thank you. And thank you all again for being here, and let's get this going. I've got 4 questions that I'm going to start for the conversation. I think most of you know there are note cards and pens available. If you have any questions, I ask you to write them on a note card. My only request is out of respect for our panelists, just keep the questions relative to campaign finance reform or ethics in Congress so we can focus on that today. We're going to have more public forums with different areas of consideration, and we can always get your questions then. So I'm going to tee it up with the first question, which is, how have special interests used money to shape our political dialogue in ways that may not be immediately clear to members of the public? And what should we be watching for? Congressman?
Well, the answer is they're used every which way they can to affect how policy gets made, affect the conversation in politics. It's much more sinister than many people appreciate. You can see it take the form of an amendment that never makes it into a committee discussion because there's some special interest that's given a lot of money to a lot of members of that committee.
Talk about dark money.
We need more, yeah. Somebody's leaning against the wall there.
Well, as long as everybody's comfortable, as long as the microphone's working.
So I'll keep talking. So the point is that the special interests will find ways that their money can impact the bottom line when it comes to policy. So they figure out what the leveraging points are within, in this case, Congress, and then they direct their efforts to achieve those goals. The fact of the matter is, Dean, that they have capitalized on a system now where it costs incredible amounts of money to run a campaign. Every 2 years now, the average campaign for Congress costs about $1.6 million on average. So to raise that kind of money, people have to go to folks who have a lot of money. They go to the special interests who basically set up shop to write those checks. They're very happy to do it. But in return for that, they want special access. They get influence. They're on the inside of the room rather than on the outside of the room. And they use that to direct public policy in ways that benefit them but don't benefit many Americans out there. So there's plenty of examples you can point to. The tax bill that was written, the so-called tax reform bill, was written largely by Wall Street and big corporations and the wealthy in this country. When you look at who it benefits, 83% of the benefits of that tax reform went to the wealthiest Americans and to big corporations. It was very clear to members of Congress how they needed to vote among the broad swath of the Republican caucus based on what their donors wanted. And in fact, you had members of Congress who were admitting openly, including Chris Collins, the fellow just got into trouble up in New York, that his donors were calling him and saying, if you don't deliver on this tax bill, don't ever call me again. That's how blatant the influence was that they were seeking to wield with their campaign contribution. Paul Ryan's PAC received $500,000 from the Koch brothers, within 3 days of the tax bill being passed. That's called payment on delivery. That's essentially what's going on there. Well, people don't want to see that, but that's the kind of system we have right now. You look at the oil and gas industry, you look at the chemical industry leaning in, using their money to affect environmental policy in this country. You look at the pharmaceutical industry using campaign contributions and hundreds of lobbyists that are deployed on the Hill to make sure that they get what they want to see happen in policy rather than what Americans want to see. So the point is, this is the gateway issue. Money in politics, the influence it has, is blocking progress on all of the priorities that everyday Americans want to see. And if we're going to make progress on those things, we've got to get to the root of the problem, which is the influence they have. And that's why this is the #1 issue. And again, I thank you for taking the leadership role of standing up and saying we've got to make this a priority if we're going to fix our democracy.
Thank you, Congressman. Tiffany, anything you can
Sure.
say?
Let's talk about a few other ways that it impacts our politics that we didn't already address. One is who actually even has the resources to run for Congress, right? The very first thing that a candidate for Congress is asked when they say, I'm interested in running, is, can you take 1.5 years off of your job and not have a salary? And how much can your friends and family donate, right? Because immediately how you're assessed is not who you are, what your bio is, what your profile is, how much you fit the district, what you want to bring to Congress, the voice you want to bring. It is how much money do you have and how much money can you raise? And what we know is that if we go to a system that encourages small dollar donors and public financing, that we actually can bring a wider diversity into our system and actually have them run. Here are some other ways that it impacts our system. One of the first things that you have to do if you get elected, Dean, you'll have the privilege of doing this, is you have to decide which committees you want to serve on. And I'm sure Congressman Sarbanes could talk about this, but one of the ways that is ranked is by how much money those committees you can get from those committees. So there are A-tier committees and B-tier committees and C-tier committees. That isn't about what issues they address. It is about how much money comes from those industries into the system. So from day one, upon being elected, rather than here are the problems facing our country, how do we come together and start to solve them, it is, here's how much money you have to raise to be reelected, here's the committee you need to get on so that you have the most access to those, corporate special interest in most cases, and here's how you go about doing that. Now here's what's happening though, again, let me leave you with a little bit of hopefulness, is that folks like Dean are running and they're turning the system on its head. They're going to join folks who have already taken this stand, like Congressman Sarbanes, who aren't taking any of this money, not a dime of it. Which means when Dean goes to Congress, whatever committee he's on, it will be because it is what is best for the voters of Minnesota's 3rd District. Whatever he votes on will be because it's in the best interest of Minnesota's 3rd District voters. Right? This isn't going to be based on who gives him money or who doesn't, or where he can get more money or where he can't. Because he's people-powered, not special interest powered. And that should give us all hope that it can be done a different way. That yeah, the system itself is broken, which is why we need to change it, and why we can change it. But it should bring us much hope that we actually can send people like Dean to Congress who won't be immediately caught up in that.
Thank you, Tiffany. And before we get to Ryan, on the subject of how money flows within the halls of Congress and committee assignments, if any of you have not seen it yet, there's a Facebook series called The Swamp, which is about 4 10-minute vignettes that very significantly expose how the money flows in Congress, and it's actually through the perspective more of Republican members of Congress who expose the truth about how the system operates. And I encourage you to take a look. It's called The Swamp. It's a Facebook series available to anybody. Have a look. It's very damning and terribly troublesome. Ryan Winkler.
Well, thanks. I mean, money influences, special interest money influences the process from the very beginning on deciding who is a qualified candidate to financing the campaign. I'm not as familiar with the congressional tier system for committees, and I will happy to tell you that at the Minnesota legislature there is no tiering of committees that give the most money to campaign donations, in part because Minnesota legislative races are such low-dollar affairs compared to most other campaigns nationally in other state legislatures, of course Congress, and even for executive office in Minnesota. So the system is not as blatant at the legislative level in Minnesota, but the same principles apply, which is that powerful interests, one way or another, will have their voices heard and set the agenda. Whether that is by having more lobbyists at the legislature or on Capitol Hill than anybody else, or through the donations that they make, or through the organizations that they have influence on. And it is a bipartisan issue. Though we're talking tonight a lot about corporate PACs and so forth, it is a bipartisan influence issue, because the people who have an interest and have an ideological alignment with one party or the other party will have a way of influencing things. And so I think, you can describe the problem, but it is also important to remember that really what it takes are people who are elected and show some courage, people who realize that they don't have to follow the system. One example of that in Minnesota has been Congressman Rick Nolan, who decided that he was not going to spend 20 or 40 hours a week every day he was in Congress dialing for dollars, that he was actually going to be a legislator and try to pass bills and serve his district. He just decided he was going to do it and said, I don't care what the consultants say, I don't care what the DCCC says, I don't care what anybody says, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do the work of my district. And he was rewarded in his district for doing so. It is sometimes just a matter of personal courage to decide that you are not going to play the game and that raising money from interest is not what your campaign is all about. And I think voters in this time are more aware of who their candidates are and are more interested in finding out that they're an authentic, real person who actually is there to serve than they have been in the past, and are less likely to be persuaded by mailings or TV ads or all the things that money can buy. An authentic candidate who stands for something actually has a good chance of winning. And so I think looking for candidates and people with courage is one of the other good ways that we can make sure that the influence, which will always be there, is diminished by the personal acts of the people we represent.
Thank you, Ryan. And as many of you know, the dirty little secret on Capitol Hill is that in many cases, a third to a half of a member's time is spent dialing for dollars, getting on a phone. You can't do it in your Capitol office. You walk across the street to consultants' offices and make phone calls for hours on hours on hours on end to wealthy interests and wealthy individuals for campaign contributions. And I don't know of a job in the United States that you could keep if you spent about half your time doing something totally unrelated to your work. You'd be fired. That's not how it works out in Congress, and I think that's something, the time, in addition to the quid pro quos attached to the money, is something I hope we talk about. Question number 2, how can and what are the barriers to accessing that information? Ryan, why don't we start with you this time?
Well, I'll address the state level access point. So the Minnesota Campaign Finance and Disclosure Board, of which I think there's a member or a past member in the audience, it has an excellent website for tracking money that is going into campaigns. So you can search by lobbyists to find out whether they've given money. You can search by legislator or candidate for governor, or whoever you want to search by to find out where the money has come from. And we also have disclosure for the political action committees or third-party independent expenditure committees that are very active in Minnesota state politics as well. So in Minnesota, the best place to find information is the Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. And we don't have the kind of national websites that exist to expose us at the congressional level in Minnesota, but the public resources available are excellent, and I would encourage people to check them out.
You want to say it one more time so people, it's a lot of words.
Somebody in the audience, Campaign Finance and Public Disclosure Board. Raise your hand if you've been a member or served in that, and then we can, people who have questions. Neil Peterson in the back. They can answer questions that you have about that as well.
And that's for statewide campaigns and candidates. Tiffany?
It felt like you were clearly calling out someone there. You know who you are. So on the federal level, money that is directly given to a candidate is disclosed. And you can find that through fec.gov, the Federal Elections Commission, or there's some great websites. Open Secrets is a wonderful resource, and it's so much fun to just kind of go down a rabbit hole for a while, looking at all the different places that people give. But so opensecrets.org or fec.gov are the two places to find information about who's donating to campaigns. It's also a great place to find out information about who's donating to certain political action committees. And now you know that there's a but coming, right? Because we've already talked about the need for disclosure and transparency. So here's part of the problem, is that there is a lot of money that is flowing into the system right now that is what is called dark money. It's secret money, it's undisclosed money, it's not required to meet the same level of disclosure as money directly given to a candidate. And in those cases, the problem is that I can't tell you where to go to find that. Sometimes you can go to the IRS and find some information on those organizations, but they set themselves up in such a way that they avoid being set up as a political organization. They set themselves up as a social welfare organization and still do political work. But under that designation, they're not required to disclose in the same way. And as a matter of fact, the IRS just rolled back, actually, Treasury Secretary Munchin just rolled back what little bit of disclosure requirements we had around some of these organizations. So what we know is that actually, some of the disclosure that we have, they're trying to roll back. There's a great bill in Congress. It was passed in 2010. It's called the Disclose Act, and it actually would require that any organization who spends on a political campaign, what is it, Congressman, more than $5,000, would have to disclose the donors to that. We think that this is really common sense. I know that voters of all stripes, Democrats, Republicans, Independents, want disclosure and transparency because we know sunshine is the best disinfectant. So I'll give you one more anecdote on disclosure before turning it over. The Senate side, on the House side, a candidate has to actually file their reports electronically with the FEC, so it's very easy to look things up and it's very quick and it's just all integrated. The Senate still files all of their campaign finance materials by paper, literally by paper. And Senator Tester has tried for years to pass a bill that would require the Senate do the same thing the House does. And they would have to just file electronically, so it's easier and more accessible to everyday people. And every time, the Senate keeps voting it down or not allowing a vote on it. That's the kind of thing we're up against in terms of just getting some common sense things passed and into law. But the technology's there. We could know who's funding all of these elections.
Thank you.
Let me just say something quick. Because as we talk about these solutions, I want you to have a sense that we've actually built a framework for bringing a package of reforms to the House floor if we get the gavel back within the first 100 days. So you know that this isn't just a critique. We have a set of proposals that can actually achieve meaningful change. We introduced with 160 original co-sponsors just before the 4th of July, House Resolution 975, the By the People Resolution, which is a framework in 3 baskets of reform: voting rights / voter empowerment, ethics and accountability, and campaign finance reform. It really covers the waterfront in terms of the kinds of reforms that people want to see so that they feel like their voice matters again. So for example, the disclosed bill that we haven't been able to get passed yet is part of the third basket here. It's in the campaign finance reform section of this blueprint for change and reform if Democrats get the gavel back, along with a lot of other great proposals. So I wanted to put that out there early, so as we talk about it, you know that there's something that's coming to the rescue, and if you deem the Democrats worthy of holding that gavel, we have to move quickly within the first 100 days to show that we're going to achieve some real change for the people of this country. Now, on this question of how do you find out who's spending what money? Yes, Open Secrets is a source, the FEC is a source. Different states have created these databases and so forth that you can go look at. But I have a dream, which is that I don't need to go look at that because I live in a world where we have small donor, citizen-owned elections of public financing of campaigns. So I know from the beginning that if a candidate chooses to fund and power their campaign using a public financing system, I know where the money is coming from. I don't have to go look and see if Sheldon Adelson owns this candidate or that candidate or some other candidate. I know that I own them. I, the people, I, the public, own the government. I own my own politics. That is the promise of a small donor leverage system of public financing. It puts you in charge. You own it. And here's the good news, because sometimes people say, well, you know, I hate politicians already. Why would I want to fund their campaigns, right? Well, the fact of the matter is that it's a very modest investment of public dollars to ransom your government back from the special interests that have taken it hostage. It doesn't cost a lot of money to do it. We perform the fiscal analysis, and for the cost of what it would take to close one loophole that the oil and gas industry is getting every year, you could fund a system at the federal level for 10 years that would return government to the people. We can do this, and it's happening at the state and local level across the country. We're not chasing a unicorn. We can make this happen. You can own this thing, and that's the power move. I talked at the outset, this is about power. The biggest power move that the American people can make is to say, you know what? We got this. We'll take charge of it. We'll underwrite the campaigns with the incentive of some small donations, because we're going to match those. That's how we designed it. Our bill, 6-to-1 match on small donations. We'll do it, and in return, work for us. That's pretty simple, right? We'll pay your salary. We don't like doing it, but we'll pay your salary. We'll power your campaign, and the deal is you work for us and not for the special interest. If that were the system the candidates participated in, you wouldn't need to go chase down the disclosure on the FEC website, because you know from day one that that candidate is answering and accountable to you and to nobody else. That's the dream that I have for how we can completely transform our system of funding campaigns in this country.
Yeah, a good dream. Perfect segue to our next question, which is, are there any cities or states or even other countries that we can look to relative to best practices in campaign finance?
Well, real quick, there's definitely cities and states across the country here that are creating these citizen-owned election systems. Actually, Minnesota has had forms of public financing before at the state level. You all are more familiar with that than I am, but that offers an example of some of the things that we can borrow from at the federal level. For example, our proposal includes refundable tax credits to allow people to contribute to federal campaigns, and we bring in matching dollars, etc. But look, New York City has a 6-to-1 matching system. Before they put it in place, there were whole parts of the city where no one had ever made a small donation. Why? Because candidates never went there. They raised their money from the developers in Manhattan to fund their campaigns. They're not going to go collect $25, $50 donations at some house party. It's not worth it to them. Then they put a 6-to-1 match system in place. Boom. Like flowers blooming in the desert, all of a sudden, All across New York, small donations coming in because the candidate said, it pays me to go there. It pays me to go to a living room and be with 30 real people and collect $25 donations and get matching funds and power my campaign that way, so I'm going to go there. So they changed the system there. Arizona has a public financing. Connecticut has public financing. Montgomery County, Maryland, Howard County, Maryland just put systems in place that we're very proud of. And people love these things. And once you get ownership of that, you don't want to let go. And that's why I see a day where, if a lot of this is happening at the state and local level, people are going to say, well, wait a second, they're going to go into the voting booth. Because, by the way, it's the same citizens that vote for local officials and federal officials. It's not like we have one pool that votes for our federal candidates and another pool that votes for us. So they're going to go in there and say, I feel really good about this side of the ballot, because those are my local candidates, and they got a great system of financing campaigns, which I feel like I own, so I feel good about that, but not so much about the people on this side, because they don't have that system, and they're going to start asking the question, why can't we do that in Washington? Why can't we build a system in Washington? So like I said, we're not chasing a unicorn on this, team. This is happening. People are taking their anger, instead of picking up pitchforks and torches, they're designing systems where they own elections and they own their government, and they're getting a good positive return from that.
Thank you. Any cities, states, even other countries that have a system that we should at least look to for ideas?
Sure. One of the things that we're most excited about, besides everything that Congressman Sarbanes just said, because when I listen to him describe the system we could have, it is big enough and bold enough that it could actually restore hope and faith in our government, right? Right now, only 7% of Americans think that the government is working for them. 93% think it's working for big interest.
It is working for about 7%.
I want to know those 7%. But yeah, they're not wrong, except that we could actually flip that, and we could have it to where we have a representative democracy that represents us again. And that's what I love about Dean Phillips' campaign too. It's 54,000 individuals powering this campaign. It's how many hundreds of house parties. I've been at some of them. This is a people-powered movement. So, and where we're seeing so much incredible momentum is in the states. States aren't waiting around for the federal government to get this right. They're taking action and they're taking change now. We're working on 6 different state ballot measures right now, this cycle. Massachusetts, Missouri, North Dakota, South Dakota, Arizona. A big reform package just passed in Alaska. We're not talking about just these really blue states, right? These are places where people feel shut out of the system and where they're taking back their state, and they're gonna come take back their federal government too. So in these state ballot initiatives, what we see is everything from small dollar donor programs to disclosure, to cleaning up ethics, to putting in contribution limits, there's a range of things that the states are doing. And what I love is that they're trying so many different things to take back their elections at the state and local level too. So we're proud to be a part of that effort.
Thank you.
And I think so we should, how many people here participated in the $50 contribution refund program in Minnesota? We've had that in place for a long time. Some years it's there and some years it's not because of funding. And I will say that despite the fact that Republicans participate in the program more than Democrats, it has been Republicans who have worked to kill that program off and Democrats who have worked to save it. So you got to figure it's not self-interest, but it's actually about which party believes in the ability of the average person to participate in the political process. And so Minnesota is a pretty good system, right? You can give $50 to the candidate of your choice and you get $50 back. We have a public subsidy program. So for example, I have a state house race. It's a 65% district by and large for the DFL year in and year out. I will get over $7,000 from the state of Minnesota for my campaign to help fund whatever I need to do. And in exchange, I have to agree to voluntarily limit how much I spend in my race for the state house. That's true for all legislative candidates, it's true for the governor, it's true for Secretary of State. Every state election, we have voluntary limits and a sizable public subsidy program in which most people participate. So we do pretty well. And in Minnesota, the average cost of a campaign at the state level is lower than most other places. That's for the candidates. There is no limit, however, on how much outside money gets spent. And so when you're, maybe you're not a lot of undecided voters, but if you were an undecided voter or a persuadable voter, your mailbox would fill up with mail and literature. You would be getting the TV ads that talk about how horrible candidates are or how they're going to save the world. But all of that, almost all of it is spent by outside money. And there is nothing that the candidate can do about it, and there is very little the state can do to regulate it aside from disclosure. And that is why ending Citizens United and attacking corporate personhood is so essential, because until we do that, the money will just flow outside of campaigns and come in through third parties instead. And that isn't really a whole lot better, because guess what? If your party gets elected to a majority in the legislature and the Minnesota Jobs Coalition just spent $10 million helping your candidates, you know who their donors are. You don't have to coordinate it to know who was paying and writing those checks. And so the influence is there regardless of whether it is going through the candidate or whether it's going through third parties, and that's why it's so essential to attack this idea that corporations can spend money without limitation because they have the same First Amendment rights as real people do. And so it's critical that we do that. And I would just say, we also have a couple of loopholes in Minnesota law regarding disclosure that we need to close. And so we had a good bill in 2010, it wasn't perfect, and we've been fighting year in and year out to try to close it. So today, roughly speaking, I can't spend money out of my own pocket and say, elect Tiffany to the state legislature without filling out a bunch of disclosure paperwork. But I could spend a bunch of money saying, your taxes are too high and Tiffany voted to raise them higher. She's a bad legislator, send her a message. Because I didn't say vote against her, I don't have to file all the paperwork to disclose where the money came from. And so that loophole is exploited relentlessly. And so it's one of the things that we need to do at the legislature. And if Democrats win a majority in the House and potentially in the state Senate, it's one of the top items that we can attack this year.
Great, thank you, Ryan. We have so many wonderful questions that all of you submitted. I'm gonna forego our fourth question and get right to it. And I'm gonna ask some specific ones of each of you based on some of the great ones I have, and I'll try to parse them because a lot of them are similar. Starting with the End Citizens United decision, one of the questions is, what is End Citizens United doing to actually affect a constitutional amendment? So this is for you, Tiffany.
Great. So first, let's go back in time just a little bit. Citizens United, January 2010 Supreme Court decision that you have heard a lot about tonight. To simplify it, it took two really terrible ideas and merged them. One, that corporations are people, and two, that money equals speech. And it allowed for unlimited and undisclosed money to be spent in our elections. And what we know before Citizens United, look, there was money in politics. We know that there was a lot of money in politics and that there were things that we were trying to address, like the Disclose Act, right? That was actually introduced even before Citizens United was decided. But in 2008, there was $143 million of outside spending in elections across the country. It's a lot of money. But in 2016, there was $1.4 billion of outside spending, a 900% increase in just a few short years. And what that's meant is that rather than Dean being able to control his own message to voters about who he is and what he stands for and what he's going to go fight for and what he's going to work on, about 2/3 of the spending in competitive congressional races are now spent by outside spending. And they control who you are, what you stand for, what your priorities are. And Representative Winkler just described that Tiffany likes to vote for higher taxes, right? Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be true. So, we want to overturn Citizens United. We also know that there's a lot of really good common sense pieces of legislation we need to pass in the meantime to start cleaning up the system. On the state level, there are 19 different states that have passed passed ballot measures saying that we need a constitutional amendment to overturn Citizens United. 19. I think that surprises most people because they didn't know that there was this momentum going on at the state level. We're working at the state and local level to support those ballot initiatives and to get more on the ballot. We're also working to elect, we know that we need the right leaders in Congress, which is why we work every day to elect great folks like Dean Phillips to Congress. But we're working across the country. We've endorsed 200 candidates. 100 of those candidates are choosing not to take any corporate PAC money. We are fundamentally changing who's going to Congress. And we are also working on the Senate side. It's not just the House side, because guess what? We also need the right votes in place so that we can get the right justices on the Supreme Court and on federal appeals courts. What we know is that Judge Kavanaugh, who's currently nominated for the Supreme Court opening, has already ruled that unlimited spending is fine, has actually advocated for more unlimited spending, and was was part of the ruling that allowed super PACs to exist. We already know where he stands on money in politics, and it's not good. So we need to make sure that we have the right leaders in place who will also vote to nominate the right justices. So I view it as a multi-step thing. We are working on the state level. We're working to get the right leaders in place in both the House and the Senate, and we're working at the judicial level to make sure we can get the right justices in place.
Thank you, Tiffany. A few questions were about lobbyists, and the question here is, should there be some emphasis on reducing the influence of lobbyists in Congress? And I give a little context before I'll start with Congressman Sarbanes. Those of you who are following my campaign know that I often reference the fact that the pharma lobby spends about $240 million annually just on lobbying members of Congress. And of course, if any reasonable person might suspect if you're spending $240 million to lobby, you must be protecting something worth a whole lot more than that, which might explain why we have the world's highest pharmaceutical pricing and the status quo exists in perpetuity with a lack of action in Congress. So with that, Congressman Sarbanes, should there be some type of limitation of the influence of lobbyists in Congress, and how does that game work?
Yeah, absolutely. So this House Resolution 975, by the way, this is the 14-page version of it. This is the business card version of it, which we can make available to you. But the second basket, which has to do with ethics and accountability and good government and so forth, does include some proposals around addressing the influence of lobbyists. In fact, I recently introduced with Senator Michael Bennett on the Senate side, being the Senate co-sponsor, something called the Clean Politics Act, which would significantly reduce the amount of money that lobbyists can bundle up and then contribute to candidates, because that has a tremendous amount of impact on how the system works. You know, a lobbyist is coming to your office, and they're with the oil and gas industry. First thing they do is they go to the ledger, and they look to see what contributions have been made by the PACs that are associated with that industry. So they know going in how amenable you're going to be to what they want to say to you. Now, what's interesting is if you don't take any PAC money, you can really fluster these folks because they don't know how to work the game as well, right? I don't have a problem with lobbyists per se. They have good information and expertise. It ought to be part of the conversation. The problem is when they metaphorically, figuratively bring bags of money along with them, because then that tips the scale in their direction. I mean, we talk about special interest. Well, a nonprofit that's doing really good work in your district can be a special interest. Problem is they can't really compete with a special interest that's got a ton of money. So one way you level the playing field in terms of access to the policymakers to get them the information that they need to make smart decisions about policy is you pull the money piece out. So the Clean Politics Act does that. Another thing it does is it closes a loophole right now that allows people that are lobbying on behalf of foreign interests, parentheses, Paul Manafort, end parentheses, to file under the Lobbying Disclosure Act, which has much less kind of transparency to it than the Foreign Agent Registration Act, but there's a loophole, and if you are indirectly engaged by a foreign government as opposed to being directly engaged, you can take advantage of that loophole. So we're going to close that up. Because basically all you want, you, the people of America, want, is that people who are in Washington, who are acting as lobbyists, they need to raise their hand and say, I'm a lobbyist. And they need to register, and they need to disclose, and they need to be transparent. And then you want to make sure they're not bringing bags of money along on their visits, because that's going to tilt the way the system operates. So we got to shut that kind of influence economy down, that ecosystem down. So that's one of a number of proposals that's included in the kind of clean good government basket that's addressed by HRES 975.
And before we get to, I want to hear Ryan's thoughts too on the subject. There's a similar question, and it is, when did both houses of Congress invite lobbyists to become directly involved in writing legislation?
Well, they didn't invite him so much as it was a trade-off. It was a trade. Coupled with, unfortunately, in the last few years, the fact that we've cut back on our own capacity as members of Congress. Committee staff have been cut, member staff have been cut, the Congressional Research Service, Library of Congress has been cut. These were all things that were resources to us so that we could think for ourselves. But when you cut back on that, then we become more dependent on the lobbyists to write the laws. They get directions from the industries they represent on how those should be written, and that's what's going on. I mean, a lot of times, I'm sad to tell you that as legislation is coming together in the wee hours of the morning, I'm finding out about the changes much later than the lobbyists are finding out about the changes, because they got a direct line into the room. That's not the way the government should operate. That's outrageous. I want to tell you a story about how much things have changed. There was a senator named John Stennis, very distinguished senator from Mississippi for years. He was chairman of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate. He never had to raise more than a couple $100,000 to run a campaign for the Senate. I mean, now you spend that in a day on a Senate seat in some places. In 1982, some consultant came to him and said, look, or his campaign manager said, you're going to have a tough race. There's this young guy running named Haley Barbour, went on to become a Republican operative, head of the RNC and so forth, governor. And he's going to challenge you. And he's going to raise a couple $1 million and run television ads. And Stennis says, well, he says, what am I going to do? The guy says, well, you're going to have to raise that much money too. And Stennis says, how am I going to do that? Never raised more than a couple $100,000 in my life. So the guy says to him, he says, you're head of the Armed Services Committee. And your committee has jurisdiction over all of these industry players and defense contractors and so forth. So you should go to them and ask them if they'll contribute to your campaign. And according to the account of this, which is in the money, Too Damn Much Money, by the book, Too Damn Much Money by Robert Kaiser, the Washington Post, according to the account, the consultant was standing there and Stennis kind of put his head down at his desk for about a minute, and then he looked up at the guy and he said, would that be proper? Now we've gone in a span of 30 years from a place in our politics where the question is, would that be proper, to a place where it's par for the course, it's normal operating procedure. That's how far we've moved. But we can get back to a place of more responsible government. And we can do it if you believe it will happen. You have the power. 330 million Americans are more powerful than two brothers named Koch. They're more powerful than Mitch McConnell. They're more powerful than all the PACs out there if we organize and we put people like Dean Phillips in office. This man is absolutely committed to the change that we're talking about tonight. The best thing you can do, among all the other steps you can take, to ensure that what we're talking about is not just a fantasy, but that it can come true, is to go pull the lever for him in this district. That's the best thing that you can do, and I'm begging you to do it because we need people like him in Washington. Yay.
Your experience at the state level with lobbyists and crafting legislation and influence?
Lobbyists are the representatives of the interests that they are hired to advocate for at the Capitol, whether it's at the state Capitol or the nation's Capitol. And so a lobbyist for the Children's Defense Fund in Minnesota doesn't represent a lot of money or a lot of door knockers or a lot of anything except some good ideas. A lobbyist for the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce or the Minnesota Business Partnership, it represents all the largest employers in the state. So their influence is vastly different depending on what they're representing and what kind of money and influence their organizations represent. So there is no question that at the Minnesota State Capitol at the end of session, lobbyists are in the room working directly with legislative leaders or bill authors to craft deals way before other members know about it. And some of it is because a lot of what a legislature does is sort out interests. It tries to come to a point where two different interests will agree. Whether doctors and physician's assistants can practice certain medical procedures is something that the state legislature decides. And so much of it is done on a consensus basis. If both industry groups agree, then the legislation goes through. And quite often what happens is not necessarily a bribe or hard corruption of promising campaign donations. What happens is that people start to forget that the lobbyists and the interests that they represent are not the same thing as their constituents. They have a reason for being there. And most of the money that is spent on lobbying at the state capitol is for one version or another of crony capitalism. It is for businesses that want to come to the Capitol and get something for it, for their business. The average, mom and pop business owner, a member of a local chamber of commerce in Fergus Falls does not have much influence on the agenda for the business partnership of the Chamber of Commerce. They speak for the big players, the very biggest players. And so it is easy thing for legislators to forget that just because somebody is speaking for the Chamber of Commerce does not necessarily mean that they are speaking for all business owners in their district. And I think so much of the responsibility for how the influence that lobbyists have, and I hate to say it, comes down to the laziness of elected officials. They often don't want to think for themselves. They often get caught up in a system at the nation's capital or the state capital where everybody knows each other. It kind of becomes a little small town, a little buddy system, and you trust certain people, you don't trust others, but people start to forget that they are not necessarily hearing from the average person in their district. And so I think that the voice of citizens, anybody who writes a letter to the legislator, or even better, shows up at their office, is a lobbyist in a way. And it is surprising how much power and influence you have as a citizen, whether it's the Hopkins Legislative Coalition for the Hopkins School District, or any number of other citizen initiatives. You showing up at the Capitol and having your voice be heard is a form of influence, and it is in many ways the best way to remind legislators that they need to hear from people. I carried the state's minimum wage bill in 2013 and 2014. And if we had left it up to the people inside the Capitol to decide how high the state's minimum wage would be, it would be, $8 an hour, $7 an hour. It would be very wimpy. And while I believe it still should be higher than it is, it was only because we formed a coalition of outside groups and citizens to influence the legislature and bring their voices in that we were able to pass a strong bill in 2014. And it's the same message that you talked about with Dean's campaign of getting involved. Get involved and pay attention to the legislative process. If you think lobbyists have too much influence, become knowledgeable and let your voice be heard, because it has a powerful counter effect when people who actually give you votes. Remember, money doesn't give you votes, right? Money can help you get votes, but votes are the thing that you need to get reelected. And so when the actual people who can give you their vote show up and talk, it's a louder voice than I think you realize.
A few of you asked if term limits are part of this discussion, so I'm going to start with you, Tiffany. Are term limits, or should they be part of this discussion? And also a tag-along question. The Swamp, the series that I mentioned on Facebook, suggests that long-term staffers in Congress really run the show. Who are these people, and is that true? So are term limits, or should they be part of this conversation? And what are the implications, perhaps, of long-term staffers actually running Congress, whether we got them or not? Starting with you, Tiffany.
So I'm actually going to answer the last question to lead into this question. So in the 1970s, only about 3% of members of Congress and or senior staffers left Congress to go become lobbyists. Anyone want to take a guess at what that percentage is today? I hear 40 and I hear 75. It's in between. I believe it's now 57%. Pharma is one of the higher revolving door industries, and it's 62% of their 1,400 lobbyists. 1,400. So there's been a real culture change around just people who, there's so many really, really dedicated and good public servants who are both members of Congress and staffers who are trying to do the best possible work. And there is no way, I was the chief of staff on the Hill, and I will tell you that there were times I was expected to know things like, I don't know, high frequency trading on stock exchanges. Yeah, that's not my specialty. And the people whose specialty that is, many of those at like Congressional Research Services and others that the congressman was talking about, those resources have been cut back. So there are places where staffers and congressional members need more information. Nobody can be an expert on everything. At the same time, we need to have that balanced with making sure that this isn't just a rehearsal show for getting paid more money once they leave Congress, right? So I believe that one of the important pieces of ethics reform is also closing some more of that revolving door that we've seen between Congress and industries, and actually making sure that folks who are there to serve are serving and aren't just trying out for their next big gig. So term limits. What I found amazing about working with so many candidates across the country this cycle is that so many of them are putting together their own plans for how to help clean up Washington. And many of them have taken a term limit pledge themselves. They've said, I'm only gonna serve 3 terms or 4 terms. This isn't, I'm then coming back home. So many of them have kind of taken that pledge themselves. Obviously, there is also expertise that develops within Congress as you have people who have been there and who have served. And we need expertise in order to also make sure we have smart legislation. So I think there has to be a balance between the two. How do we make sure that the voice stays with individuals and with the voters, while also making sure that we have smart, capable people who are serving in Congress and who have the resources they need in order to be able to address and tackle these really big, difficult problems. Did I mention pharma? 1,400 lobbyists.
That's 3 for every member of Congress.
That's 3 for every member of Congress. So I think that we need to focus on tackling that problem.
And on the term limit, so I think you can solve, I think that the demand for term limits comes from the frustration that people have that these incumbents are just sitting back and they get elected time and time again. So I think if you fix the money piece of it, you can actually address a lot of the frustration that leads people to the term limit solution. Absolutely, a candidate or a member of Congress who puts their feet up on the desk and just collects PAC checks for their next campaign and isn't hustling out there, isn't trying to meet people, isn't staying engaged, that person should be vulnerable. The problem is they're not vulnerable right now because it's hard to challenge them because they have access to all the money. But if you put a system in place that allowed challengers to be more viable, because if they went and collected small donations and they earned matching funds and so forth, they could become viable and competitive, then one of two things would happen. Either the incumbent who's sitting there fat and happy would realize, you know, I better get my act together and get out there and start representing people again, and would do that and would be competitive, and maybe you decide to send them back for the right reasons, or they wouldn't do that, and the challenger, who now can be competitive because you set up a system where they can raise the dollars they need to get their voice out there onto the playing field, they could actually go take that incumbent out. I like that better because, again, that keeps the power with the people. There's something a little bit arbitrary about a term limit, because what if that member of Congress or legislature is actually doing a pretty good job and is really paying attention to you? And you want to send them back, and they've got the expertise, and they've got a great track record, and they come to all the town halls, and they're really, you want them there, but you can't have them anymore because there's a 3-term limit that's been imposed arbitrarily. So I want you to have the power. But I want you to have the toolkit that really gives you that power and lets you hold that power. The other thing is, if you pull these people out, it is actually the longtime staffers and the lobbyists. They don't have term limits. In Sacramento, I think it's a 3-term limit there for the state legislature. So just as people are getting to where they, as legislators, are developing enough expertise to do some good, boom, they get yanked out. Who doesn't get yanked out? The longtime lobbyists that hang around the State House in Sacramento. They end up making all the laws. They're the ones with the power. So all of this has to be about your power. How do you make sure that you keep the power? First of all, you got to get it. But then how do you hold your power in your own democracy? That's what this is about. And it fits into those 3 baskets. The first part of power is, I want to be able to vote. Make it easy, not hard, for me to vote in America. Respect me as a voter. That's number 1, that's power. Number 2, when legislators go to Washington or to the State House in Minnesota or wherever it is, they should behave. Just behave.
You can clap.
Don't
You can clap.
No conflicts of interest, no ethical lapses. Just behave yourself. You're there to represent us. Don't forget who sent you. And the third thing is, don't get tangled up in the money. Right? Don't let it cloud your judgment. Form those blind spots. Build those filters that have you leaning towards special interests and away from what that's all you want. All of that's power. You can get this. You can get it with this guy, and you can get it with people like him who are running all across the country and understand that we need to put these democracy reforms in place. So you just got to make it happen.
Thank you. Before we get to Ryan on the subject of term limits, ethics, a big part of this conversation. Everything we're talking about begins with ethics. What is ethical behavior as it relates to campaigning in this country, in a democratic republic such as ours? And many of you know, in just the last 2 weeks, 2 members of the U.S. House of Representatives, Representative Collins in New York, charged with insider trading, and Representative Duncan Hunter, charged with misuse of campaign funds. And if anybody saw the laundry list, I'm sorry?
His wife did it.
That's right. Yeah. He ordered the steak and she ordered the 30 tequila shots.
We want the plane ticket for the rabbit.
But that's just the last 2 weeks. And as we have this conversation to recognize, we're talking about campaign finance reformation, but the culture of corruption and the ethics and the devaluation of ethics in our U.S. Congress is of great concern and needs to be incorporated into this conversation. So I'm glad that's part of what Congressman Sarbanes is talking about. Ryan, your experience or your perspective on whether or not term limits you think should be part of this conversation, both at the state level and also the federal level.
I guess I'm of the school that says the voters should get to elect anybody that they want, whether they've served a number of terms or not. But I think, and maybe this is still going to come up, but it does call to question what the districts are and how the lines are drawn in gerrymandering, because so many people live in congressional districts where there's only one way that district is ever going to vote, and so you don't really ever have a meaningful choice. So I think the constitutional challenges taking place at the Supreme Court on gerrymandering are hopeful. The possibility, and you probably both know better than I, that states, more and more states are pursuing commissions to draw congressional district and state legislative district lines rather than having partisan lines drawn to advantage one party over another. I think that's a better and more valuable reform that gives voters more power than saying that they can't elect somebody because they've already served for 3 terms, even though they may be great. So I think there are other better ways of tackling it. And certainly, in Minnesota, we may get more into redistricting, but we have fairly decent and fair lines because they've been drawn by the courts since the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. Essentially, when one person, one vote became the constitutional law of the land, Minnesota courts have been the ones who've drawn it, because this is just a quirk of history, not because the parties haven't tried to do it, it's just that no one party has ever had full control of state government at the right time, with one exception, and that was in 1990, and the Republicans passed redistricting lines that favored them heavily, and Governor Carlson signed the bill a day too late. And so by that one court, Minnesota has had the courts draw them every single time since the 1960s.
By the way, redistricting reform is part of the package that I talked to you about. It's in that first basket. So
we've got about 15 minutes left. I'm not going to be able to get to every question, but I'm trying to group them, at least in the categories. A couple people asked about McCain-Feingold, the last effort to reform our campaign finance system. It surely had consequences. It had good intentions, but significant consequences. Perhaps we can speak about that for a moment. Maybe starting with you, Tiffany.
Sure, I was going to let the Congressman go first on this one.
Well, I guess McCain-Feingold was about putting limits on certain kinds of spending, and so what it did was it ran into like spending by parties and other kinds of groups out there and constituencies. So it was the right impulse, but it's run headlong into the jurisprudence of the Roberts Court, which is striking down anything that they view as putting limitations on people's First Amendment rights. And as Tiffany said, if you equate money and speech, then it gets much more complicated in terms of reining in these special interests and independent expenditures and so forth. So McCain-Feingold kind of got caught on the horns of this push by the court over the last few years. It calls to mind sort of 2 frames that I use on how we address the power of money in politics. One is to put rules in place and contain the influence of big money. And that's what you do with a constitutional amendment, which would get around this court's viewpoint by actually putting into our Constitution the ability to regulate big money. And McCain-Feingold would have fared much better if you had that kind of constitutional change in place. So there's rules. Disclosure is a rule on how to restrain the big money players. A constitutional amendment is a rule. It's kind of like a referee throwing a flag on the field of your democracy when the big money players are getting out of hand. And we need that. But we also need the other piece, which is the empowerment piece. So there's the containment piece, and then there's the empowerment piece. And the fact of the matter is, just putting a ref on the field doesn't get everyday Americans out of the bleachers and onto the field of their own democracy. That's what I want to see. I want you to flood the zone. I want you to come onto the field and be power players yourself. And that's what this small donor leverage systems of public financing do. They get you out of the bleachers of your own democracy where you're sitting as spectators, watching the big money players and trying to throw the flag every so often. You know, Marco Rubio got a super PAC contribution. Throw the flag, right? Or Sheldon Adelson gave all this money. Let's have disclosure. Throw the flag. But it's still Sheldon Adelson and the super PAC and all the big money crowd. They're on the field. You're sitting up here. We need to get you out of the bleachers and onto the field. So there's got to be an empowerment strategy as well as this idea of kind of containing the big money. We can do the containment better if we get the kind of change that we want to see with a constitutional amendment. We can do the other stuff, which the court has said is fine, voluntary participation in new ways of funding campaigns in America. You can do that without the court striking it down. So that's right there in front of you. And I think we can get that if we work hard.
Tiffany.
He did so much better than I was getting ready to do. I think the only, the things I would add is that it also matters what folks running for office and what folks who are in office think you care about. Mitch McConnell has a infamous quote from a few years ago that said, "Voters care as much about campaign finance reform as they do about static clean." Now, I think he's wrong.
I care a lot about static clean.
But you care more about
I care more about campaign finance.
Dean Phillips' slogan, no matter what your number one issue is, make campaign finance your number two issue and static clean your number three issue. Starch comes in a distant 10. So look, I think one of the things that we've seen is that the headwinds that we have faced in the courts isn't by accident. It is by a concerted effort by folks who want to influence the system by putting big money in to tear down the rules that have been put in place to try to keep big money in check. And I totally agree about the empowerment strategy, but I do think that there has been a orchestrated effort to tear down the limits that we have in place. And frankly, they're still trying to tear down what remaining limitations we have, right? Mitch McConnell wants to get rid of all aggregate limits on an individual. They want to repeal the Johnson Amendment, which has been in place obviously since, LBJ, that says that churches can't do political work. Churches and charities can't do political work. They want to repeal that. They want our churches and charities to suddenly be another vehicle to funnel political money and political speech. That terrifies me, I have to say. So we know that they actually are continuing that push. And I believe that the strongest way to push back on that is that we all have to speak up. That we actually have to show that Mitch McConnell's dead wrong about voters caring about this. We know that voters understand that money in politics impacts their day-to-day lives through higher prescription drug costs, through tax reform bills, through climate change legislation, through just who folks on Capitol Hill are answering to. Exactly. And that's what we need. We need you all speaking up and making sure that they hear that this issue matters. And so make it your number one issue, right? Go one up Dean and make it your number one issue. And here's the other thing. We actually know that all of us joining together does empower and does change the system. In 2007, Barack Obama put together the biggest grassroots small dollar funding program that we had ever seen. Before him, Howard Dean in 2004, right? Like we have seen, and every time we say, oh, we can't see bigger, we can't see more. My organization is funded every day by people giving an average of just $13. 4 million people across the country joining together to say that they want to end Citizens United and get big money out of politics. We've seen how it empowers everyday campaigns and candidates across the country. So I actually totally disagree with people who say that we've seen kind of the limits of small dollar donations. I think we've just seen the beginning of it.
was McCain-Feingold, and the good intentions, but had significant consequences. Anything you want to add to the conversation?
Well, anybody know the opening line of the book, All the President's Men, about Watergate? It's, who the hell's Ken Dahlberg? And it's a quote from Nixon asking about the identity of a Wayzata, Minnesota businessman who gave the money that led to the payoffs of the burglars that brought the whole presidency down. And the thing that we have in common right now with the Watergate era, in addition to, you know, a number of things, obvious, is that Watergate spawned a huge reaction. And all of the federal campaign finance laws that we have had in place until McCain-Feingold were passed in the wake of Watergate. And then what happened afterwards is that the courts slowly ate away at all of the reforms. And so I do think, and Dean's campaign is a great illustration of this, the reaction to deep-seated corruption, personal ethical failures, and criminality in the White House has been a wave of reform in the past. And there is every reason to think that we can have a wave of reform in the future that can clean these things up. But we have to watch the Supreme Court. Conservatives have figured this out, and they figured it out a generation ago. Bringing up a whole generation of judges who never say anything on the record until the time comes to put them on the bench at the highest level they're going to achieve, and then Katie bar the door. Suddenly, there is no restriction or limit on what they will do. And we are seeing that at the Supreme Court level right now. And so today we've got 2 U.S. senators who have a vote on the appointment of Kavanaugh, and I think we're going to be well served by our 2 senators. But this election will in part fall on that, and I think it is absolutely essential that people who care about money and politics speak up on this issue of court appointments. And when the next election comes around, it's important to remember that whether you love our candidate for president or not on our side, it's not just one branch of government that's on the ballot, it's 2. And whoever appoints the judges appoints the ideology and the direction of the court, sometimes for a generation. So it's absolutely essential that we are organized around the idea that the courts matter, and we, even if we have these moments of opportunity where we can pass legislation because the political winds suddenly shift and the opportunity is there, the courts can eat them up over time, and we have to preserve that too. Thank you.
So we're reaching the end of our allotted time. I'm going to ask one more question of all of our panelists, then a couple of rapid-fire questions for you, Congressman, and then we'll wrap it up. The question in my hand asks, this all seems so logical. So, what is the counter-argument? Why would anybody argue to keep Citizens United? Starting with you, Ryan.
Thanks for that question, Steve.
You can say nothing.
I suppose the answer would be people with money and power deserve what they got, and everybody else can, buzz off. And so, I guess it's sort of like social Darwinism or something. Those with money deserve it, and everybody else who don't have money or power shouldn't have it, and therefore the system works just as it's supposed to.
Tiffany.
Because obviously everyone pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, right? So I think the ones that we get the most are that putting limits on who can give or how they participate in our political system is a violation of free speech rights. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think that if you want to read a wonderful dissent, please go read the dissent in Citizens United. Just, if you'd like to read Supreme Court cases in your spare time, like nerds like me. So we get that one. We also get the money's always been a problem, it's always going to be a problem, kind of that fatalistic, cynical type of argument. I hope after listening to us for however long it's been, that you feel more hopeful. There's a bill right over there that could literally change who gets to have power in our democracy. And we just need more good folks like Dean Phillips and Congressman Sarbanes in the House of Representatives to pass it. So I fundamentally don't agree with that. Yeah, those are the 2 big ones I hear most.
Any counter argument, Congressman?
I don't think there's a good counter argument. I mean, the polling shows that 80% or more of Americans want to get rid of the Citizens United case. So I don't feel an obligation to think too hard about why there's 20% that don't think this is a problem. If there's 80% who realize that it is a problem, and you know, yeah, it's this idea money is speech and you shouldn't inhibit my speech and so forth. The problem is that if money is speech, then what kind of speech do people have if they don't have money? And one of the things that attracts me about, again, a small donor system of public financing is you're giving more power to the speech of people who don't have it. And they can put their voice out there and be heard. But look, people want this change. We just got to go get it. And let me tell a real quick story that kind of gets to that. There is a guy named Larry Lessig, who's a professor at Harvard, and he actually ran for president for about 5 minutes last time on campaign finance reform. And he invited me up to New Hampshire because for the last few years in December, he's been marching across the state in memory of a woman named Granny D. Haddock, who back in the 80s, at the age of 88, walked from Pasadena, California to Washington with a sign on her back that said campaign finance reform. Doris Haddock, Granny D. Haddock. And and she was from New Hampshire. So every year in memory of her, they do this march across the state. So I went up to participate in this, and 0-degree weather. I marched 7 miles, you know, along this back road with tractor trailers going by us. And that night we had a forum in Concord at the University of New Hampshire Law School, and Lessig had commissioned a poll that showed that 96% of Americans think that money in politics is a problem, but 91% think there's nothing we can do about it. Now Lessig was obsessed with the 4% who don't think it's a problem. So where are these people? He was walking up to farmers in the fields and saying, "Are you one of the 4% who don't think it's a problem?" They're like, "Not me." I, on the other hand, was incredibly excited at the fact that there were 5% who think we can do something about it. Because I figure if there's 5%, we can start there. And I told that story when I was in Maine campaigning for their ballot initiative to strengthen their public financing system. And Andy Bossi, who was the head of that thing, got all excited. He said, maybe if we win up here in Maine, that 5% will go to like 8 or 9%. And then I told the story in Seattle when they put their ballot initiative to get these speech vouchers. And the person said, well, maybe the 8-9% will go to 12 or 13%. We can do this. It can happen. We get examples of it every day at the state and local level. We just got to make it happen at the national level. So you need to believe it can happen. And I believe it will happen because we'll get people like Dean Phillips to come and be part of the effort.
And if it makes anybody feel better, that 5% is actually a good number, because right now in Congress, only 1% of the House of Representatives are part of the No PAC caucus, including Congressman Sarbanes. Only 6 members of the House of Representatives refuse all PAC money. I'd love to be lucky number 7. On the question of consequences and counter-arguments, I should point out that when the Kane-Feingold was being debated back in 2002, the counter-argument was that if you limit or cap contributions to the national parties, which is what McCain-Feingold did, that it would only inspire the formation of independent expenditure committees and special interest groups to instead receive that money. And special interest groups have no interest in catering or building a tent for a lot of people. It's very distinct focuses, obviously. Whereas the parties at least have a vested interest in catering to more voters. So one of the consequences of something that had good intentions was, in fact, the proliferation of all the dark money and independent expenditure committees. A couple of rapid-fire questions for you, Congressman. Do members of Congress really spend hours a day talking to wealthy contributors?
Yes.
Thank you. If the Democrats win the House, the lion's share of corporate money will begin to flow back to Democrats, and the money always follows the winners. Why should we believe Democrats would implement your plan?
Because I think the people will be watching, and I think we will be electing, based on what Tiffany told you a few minutes ago, a lot of new candidates who've taken a pledge not to receive corporate PAC money. They're putting that pledge out there, people are responding to it, and I think if they renege on that, they'll be in a really perilous position. I think incumbent members of Congress who maybe haven't been pressed as hard on this because they're not in that kind of challenger space, they're starting to realize that, you know, the tide is shifting, and it's going to be a measure of how ready you are to take on interests that have a different agenda for the country than what most Americans want to see. And I think it's fair. Now, having said that, is it fair when you got to raise $1.6 million to run a competitive campaign for Congress, to ask a member of Congress to overnight give up all their PAC money, if that's how they've raised money for their campaign, if you are not going to give them a system to replace it? I don't think so. So that's the other part of this bargain. If we're going to insist that members of Congress don't go hat in hand to the corporate special interests and the PACs to fund their campaigns, we got to build a replacement system for that. That you all power, so they have a real choice. Then it's fair to hold them accountable. Say, well, wait a second. We gave you a choice here. You can raise money for your campaign by finding small donors and earning matching funds, powering your campaign that way, or you can go to special interests. You now have a choice. And if they choose to stick with the special interest side of things, then it's fair to come after them and say, wait a second, you're not representing us, because you've given them another system. We need to build it, and let me tell you, if you build it, they will come. We want to power our campaigns that way. We don't want to go up to K Street and do some fundraising event. First of all, you're with a bunch of people who don't live in your district. They are never going to make phone calls for you. They're never going to knock doors for you. They're money people. They write checks. And you hang around with them, you start thinking the way they do. But if we build a system that means your living room is the place somebody can go to be competitive in powering their campaign, we'll be there in an instant. We just got to build that for people. So I think it's fair to say to candidates, you got to stop this with the corporate money. But if we're going to insist on it, we got to build some other place that they can go, which is where America lives, to power their campaign, and that will be real accountability again.
Thank you. All right, so I'm going to take the last two questions and make some closing remarks, and then we're going to wrap this up. I think this is probably the most important question of the evening, and it reads, until meaningful campaign reform comes about, what does a talented candidate of modest financial means and fundraising capability do if he or she wishes not to accept PAC money as they run against someone who is funded by PAC special interests? And some of you might know that I've challenged, actually invited, Eric Paulson to run this race in what I call the Minnesota way, which is simply getting rid of the PAC and special interest money, getting rid of self-funding, and disavowing, and actually doing something to disavow, all of the outside money that flows into this race. This might be a $30 million campaign, most of which will be spent in the next 80 days. 2/3 of that money will come from outside interests that have absolutely no interest in ours, most assured. And so the answer to this question is, if I should succeed and have the honor of serving in Congress and get to work with people like Congressman Sarbanes and others, we will do something to inspire people of more modest means and lacking connections to the wealthy class and wealthy interests to run, because this nation needs more people like that to run. And when you look at what's happening in Florida in their gubernatorial race, in the state of Illinois, we have candidates investing tens of millions of personal dollars in their races. Of course, that all but precludes people of modest means from participating. So we have a responsibility to our country, to our democracy, to ensure that the next generation of potential leaders have a chance. And that's part of this whole conversation. And if Congressman Paulson would sign the Minnesota Way Pledge, we would be the only race in the entire country that does it in the way that I wish the whole nation did, and I hope that one day we will. The last question is more of a statement, but this is how we're going to close. And it says, how about an informed and educated electorate? and that's where we come to the most important part of my campaign, which is, of course, everyone's invited. And the fact that all of you came tonight, who are informed, are educated, and want to learn more, which is the whole reason we put on this forum tonight, I'm grateful. Because from a voice can grow a chorus, and my hope and my invitation to all of you is to take what you heard tonight, go see Dark Money when it opens here in Minneapolis on September 7th, go, when you're home on your computers, watch The Swamp on Facebook, go visit End Citizens United's website, have a look at Representative Sarbanes' legislative propositions. To the extent that we can collectively become educated, become advocates, and affect the change that our country really needs. Let's get to it. And I'm grateful that you all took the time to be here tonight. I would love to be your next member of Congress, and change is coming, my friends. So thanks for being part of it.